The U.S. trade shock. Why Canadian small businesses are hitting the reset button. You know, there's this stat that came across my desk recently that just stopped me in my tracks. Nearly half, 46%, of Canadian small business owners no longer view the U.S. as a reliable trading partner. Think about that for a second. The U.S., not some emerging market with political instability, not a country on the other side of the world. We're talking about our closest neighbor, our biggest trading partner for decades. This comes from the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. And honestly, it's a wake-up call that's reverberating through boardrooms, warehouses, and manufacturing floors across the country. And here's the thing, this isn't just sentiment. It's forcing real, tangible changes in how businesses operate every single day. Hey there, I'm Scott Lindsay, and I've spent decades in the trenches of risk management. Chief Risk Officer, Chief Compliance Officer, you name it. I've also built and scaled my own internet solutions company, so I've lived both sides of this equation. And what we're seeing right now, this is one of those inflection points that separates businesses that survive from businesses that thrive. If you're getting value from this, and trust me, we're just getting started, hit that like button and drop a comment. Tell me what's happening in your sector. Are you feeling this trade pressure? I read every single comment because this stuff matters, and your experience helps other business owners navigating the same storm. So let's dig into what's actually happening here because the headlines don't tell the full story. Trade disruptions aren't some abstract economic concept. They're showing up as real costs, real delays, and real headaches for business owners trying to keep the lights on and payroll covered. There are basically three massive forces at play, and they're all hitting at once. First, businesses are being forced to diversify their supply chains away from U.S. sources. Second, they're dealing with tariff-related cost increases that are eating into already thin margins. And third, and this is the one that keeps people up at night, they're trying to navigate this fog of economic uncertainty from cross-border policy shifts that can change on a dime. Now, here's where process documentation comes in. And I know what you're thinking. Scott, documentation? Really? That's your big solution? But stay with me, because this is where a lot of businesses are leaving money on the table and exposing themselves to massive risk. When I was running enterprise risk programs for financial institutions, one of the first things I'd look at was documentation discipline. Not because I love paperwork, trust me, nobody does, but because documentation is your institutional memory. It's your playbook when things go sideways. And when trade relationships are shifting this fast, that playbook becomes your lifeline. Think about a manufacturing company that's been sourcing components from a supplier in Michigan for 15 years. They know the contact person, they know the lead times, they know exactly how to expedite an order when a customer needs something yesterday. That knowledge, it's probably sitting in someone's head, maybe scattered across some emails, but there's no formal process map, no documented supplier qualification criteria, no written contingency protocols. Then suddenly, tariffs hit, or the border slows down, or that supplier decides they can't deal with the regulatory uncertainty and pulls out of the Canadian market. Now what? You're scrambling. You're making decisions on the fly, and every day you can't fulfill orders is revenue walking out the door. Here's a use case that illustrates this perfectly. There's a food processing company, mid-sized operation, about 50 employees, that had been importing packaging materials from a U.S. supplier for over a decade. Great relationship, competitive pricing, reliable delivery. When the tariff situation started heating up, their costs jumped 18% almost overnight. The owner knew they needed to find alternatives, but here's where it got messy. They didn't have documentation on their packaging specifications beyond what was in the purchase orders. They didn't have a written qualification process for new suppliers. They didn't have clear documentation on quality requirements or testing protocols. So when they started reaching out to Canadian and European suppliers, every conversation was starting from scratch. Well, let me check with production. I think we need this thickness. I'm pretty sure we test for this. 3 months. It took them 3 months to get a new supplier qualified and operational. 3 months of paying those inflated tariff costs. 3 months of uncertainty. And you know what the kicker was? After they finally got their processes documented, specifications, qualification criteria, testing protocols, approval workflows. They onboarded their second backup supplier in 3 weeks. That's the power of documentation. It's not sexy, but it's leverage. Now let me tell you what proper documentation actually looks like in this context, because this is where businesses often get it wrong. They either go too light, a few bullet points in a Word doc that nobody updates, or they go too heavy, building some massive ISO-compliant manual that's so cumbersome nobody uses it. The sweet spot is what I call operational documentation, detailed enough to be useful, simple enough to be maintained. For supply chain diversification, you need a few key elements documented cold. First, supplier qualification criteria. This sounds basic, but you need written standards for what makes a supplier acceptable. And I'm not talking about good quality and fair price. I'm talking specifics. What certifications do they need? What's your minimum for on-time delivery performance? What financial stability metrics are you looking for? If they're in a different country, what are your requirements around customs documentation and cross-border logistics experience? Here's where this gets interesting. A distribution company was looking at diversifying from US suppliers to European sources. On paper, they found a supplier in Germany that looked perfect, great pricing, solid reputation, all the right certifications. But when they dug into their documentation requirements, they realized this supplier had never shipped to Canada before, didn't understand CBSA requirements, didn't have the right export documentation processes, didn't have experience with CUSMA certificates of origin. Because they had their qualification criteria documented, they caught this before signing a contract. They didn't end up in a situation where they'd committed to a supplier who couldn't actually deliver across the border efficiently. That documentation saved them from what could have been a six-figure mistake. Second piece, and this is critical, you need documented contingency protocols. What's your trigger for activating a backup supplier? How do you make the decision to split orders across multiple sources? What's the approval process for switching suppliers mid-production run if something goes wrong? You know what I mean? These aren't theoretical questions. When a shipment gets held up at the border, or a supplier suddenly can't meet your volume requirements, or tariffs change again, you need to know who makes what decision, based on what criteria, and what the implementation steps are. I've seen businesses lose massive opportunities because they didn't have this documented. There was a company that landed a huge contract, career-making kind of deal, but their primary supplier couldn't scale up fast enough. They had backup suppliers, but no documented protocol for how to split production across multiple sources. By the time they figured out the logistics, coordinated quality control across multiple facilities, and worked through the payment and invoicing complexities, they'd missed their delivery window. The customer walked. That's a failure of process documentation. Third element, and this one trips people up, tariff impact modeling. You need to document your cost structure in a way that lets you quickly model what happens when tariffs change. What percentage of your COGS comes from US sources? Which specific items are most vulnerable to tariff impacts? What's your price elasticity? How much can you pass through to customers before demand drops? This isn't just a spreadsheet exercise. You need documented assumptions, documented data sources, documented decision criteria, because when tariffs shift, and they will keep shifting, you need to make fast, informed decisions about pricing, sourcing, and supplier selection. A furniture manufacturer had this dialed in beautifully. They had documented their entire cost structure by component, mapped every item to country of origin, and built a model that could instantly show the P&L impact of different tariff scenarios. When new tariffs hit, they could run the numbers in hours, not weeks. They could now have informed conversations with customers about pricing. They could make strategic decisions about which components to resource domestically and which to absorb. Their competitor took 3 weeks just to figure out their exposure. By the time they had numbers, the market had already moved. Now, here's the discipline part that nobody talks about enough. Documentation isn't a one-time project. It's a muscle you build into your operations. And this is where a lot of businesses fall apart. They'll do a documentation push, usually because a crisis forced them to, or because some consultant told them to, and they'll create all these beautiful process documents. Then 6 months later, those documents are out of date because the business kept moving, but the documentation didn't. The discipline is in the maintenance. Every time you onboard a new supplier, the documentation gets updated. Every time you change a specification, the documentation gets updated. Every time you learn something new about cross-border shipping or tariff classifications, it goes into the knowledge base. And this requires systems, It requires ownership. Someone needs to be responsible for keeping this current. It needs to be part of your operational rhythm, monthly reviews, quarterly audits, annual deep dives. Here's a use case that shows what this looks like in practice. There's the electronics components distributor that appointed a supply chain documentation owner, not a full-time role, but a clear responsibility assigned to their operations manager. Part of her performance metrics became documentation currency. Every Monday morning, she'd do a 30-minute review of any supply chain changes from the previous week. New supplier, documentation updated. Price change, cost model updated. Delivery issue, incident documented with root cause and corrective action. It became routine, embedded in how they operated. When the trade environment started getting volatile, they were already 3 steps ahead. They had current documentation on every supplier relationship, every cost driver, every contingency plan. While their competitors were scrambling to figure out their exposure, they were already executing their diversification strategy. And you know what? This discipline paid off in ways they didn't even anticipate. When they went to get better financing terms from their bank, the lender was blown away by their operational maturity. Documentation became a competitive advantage in multiple dimensions. Quick pause here. If this is resonating with you, if you're seeing how this applies to your business, do me a favor and subscribe to the channel. Hit that notification bell because we're going deep on small business risk every single week. And seriously, comment below. What's your biggest challenge with supply chain documentation? Where are you getting stuck? I respond to comments and your questions help shape future content. Let me shift gears slightly and talk about what this looks like across different business types because the specifics matter. A retailer's documentation needs are different from a manufacturer's, which are different from a service business that relies on U.S. suppliers for equipment or technology. For retailers sourcing products from the U.S., the documentation focus is on product specifications and alternative source mapping. You need to know exactly what you're selling, not just brand names, but actual specifications, materials, manufacturing standards. Because when you need to source from a different country, you need to match those specs exactly or risk customer dissatisfaction. There's a sporting goods retailer who learned this the hard way. They'd been importing a popular line of athletic gear from a U.S. manufacturer. When tariffs made the pricing untenable, they found an Asian supplier that claimed to make an equivalent product. Looked similar, specifications seemed close enough. Except they hadn't documented the exact material composition, the specific stitching patterns that made the original durable, the precise fit measurements that customers loved. The substitutes came in, customers hated them, returns skyrocketed. The damage to their reputation took 2 years to recover from. Now contrast that with a kitchen supply store that had meticulously documented every product they carried. Materials, dimensions, performance specifications, even customer preference data. When they needed to switch suppliers, they could match products precisely. Customers didn't even notice the transition. For manufacturers, the documentation challenge is around process dependencies and quality control. It's not just about what you're buying, but how it fits into your production process. Thread specifications for a textile manufacturer, tolerance requirements for a machine shop, chemical composition for food processing. And here's the thing that makes this complex. It's not just your direct inputs, it's the whole chain. A manufacturer of industrial equipment was sourcing motors from a U.S. supplier. When they started looking at alternatives, they realized they'd never documented the mounting specifications, the electrical requirements, the vibration tolerances. Their production team just knew which motors worked in which applications. Moving to a new supplier meant documenting all of that tribal knowledge, creating testing protocols, validating performance across different production scenarios. It was a massive lift, but once it was done, they had operational flexibility they'd never had before. For service businesses, documentation often centers on equipment specifications and vendor capabilities. IT services companies need to document their hardware requirements, software compatibility, support level agreements. Professional services firms need to document their tool requirements, data security standards, client deliverable specifications. The pattern you're seeing here, documentation creates options, and in an uncertain trade environment, options are gold. Now, let's talk about the tariff piece specifically because this is where the cost impact really hits home. Tariffs aren't just a line item you can pass through to customers and call it a day. They ripple through your entire cost structure in ways that aren't always obvious. First, there's the direct tariff cost. You're importing something, the tariff rate goes up, you pay more. Straightforward enough, but then you've got currency impacts because tariffs affect exchange rates and your purchasing power. You've got inventory timing decisions. Do you accelerate purchases before tariff increases? And how does that affect cash flow? You've got contract renegotiations with customers who have fixed price agreements. Documentation helps you navigate all of this because you need to understand your true cost drivers. I've seen businesses think they understood their tariff exposure only to discover they'd missed indirect impacts. A company importing raw materials might calculate the tariff impact on those materials, but miss how the tariff affects their freight costs, their warehousing costs, their working capital costs. Here's where detailed process documentation becomes a strategic tool. You document every step in your supply chain, from order placement through delivery and payment. For each step, you document the costs, the timeline, the decision points, the dependencies. When tariffs change, you can trace the impact through your entire process. Maybe the direct tariff cost is 5%, but the accelerated ordering to beat tariff increases ties up working capital. The increased inventory requires more warehouse space. The more complex cross-border documentation adds administrative cost. Suddenly, your real cost impact is 12%, not 5%. Without documentation, you're flying blind. With documentation, you can make informed decisions about pricing, sourcing, and strategy. There's a really interesting use case here from a building materials distributor. They were importing lumber and engineered wood products from the U.S. When softwood lumber tariffs increased, their initial calculation showed about a 7% cost increase. Painful, but manageable. But because they had detailed process documentation, they could see the full picture. The tariff increase meant their U.S. suppliers' pricing became less competitive, but it also meant delivery times increased because the supplier was dealing with new paperwork requirements. The longer lead times meant they needed to carry more inventory. More inventory meant more working capital and warehousing cost. The paperwork complexity meant more administrative time. When they modeled it all out, the true impact was closer to 15%. That changed their entire strategic calculus. At 7%, they could absorb and wait it out. At 15%, they needed to aggressively pursue Canadian suppliers, even if it meant some short-term disruption. They documented their supplier transition plan, timelines, responsibilities, risk mitigation steps, communication protocols. They documented their customer communication strategy for managing the transition. They documented their inventory optimization plan to minimize cash tied up during the switch. 6 months later, they'd successfully shifted 60% of their volume to Canadian sources. Their competitors, who hadn't done this level of process documentation and impact analysis, were still struggling with the same U.S. suppliers and bleeding margin. The third piece I mentioned, navigating economic uncertainty from cross-border policy shifts, this is the wild card that makes everything else more complex. It's not just about responding to current tariffs or current supply chain realities. It's about building resilience into your operations so you can adapt quickly when policies change. And they will keep changing. That's not pessimism, that's realism. Trade policy has become a political football, and small businesses are caught in the middle. This is where scenario planning documentation becomes critical. You need to document different scenarios. What happens if tariffs increase another 10%? What if there are new restrictions on specific product categories? What if there's a supply disruption at a major border crossing? For each scenario, you document your response plan. What are your triggers for action? What steps do you take? Who's responsible for what? How do you communicate with customers, suppliers, employees? I know this sounds like a lot, and honestly, it is. But here's the thing. You don't build Rome in a day. You don't need to document everything perfectly before you get value. You start with your highest risk areas and build from there. Start with your biggest supplier dependencies. Start with your most tariff-sensitive products. Start with your most critical customer relationships. Document those processes first, build the discipline, then expand. A really smart approach I've seen is the crisis-driven documentation method. When something goes wrong, a shipment gets delayed, a supplier can't deliver, a tariff catches you off guard, you document everything about that incident. What happened, why it happened, how you responded, what you learned, what you'll do differently. Over time, you build up this library of documented incidents and responses. It becomes your playbook for handling disruptions, and because it's based on real situations your business has faced, it's inherently relevant and practical. There's a food importer that's been doing this for 3 years now. Every supply chain hiccup, every border delay, every cost surprise, they document it. They've got this growing database of scenarios and solutions. When new team members come on board, they read through these case studies and learn from real situations. When something similar happens again, they've got a tested response plan ready to go. It's become a huge competitive advantage. Their ability to respond quickly to disruptions, to keep product flowing when competitors are stuck, to maintain customer relationships through uncertainty, it all traces back to their documentation discipline. Look, I get it. Documentation isn't glamorous. Nobody starts a business because they're excited about writing process documents. You start a business because you've got a product you believe in, or a service you're passionate about providing, or you see an opportunity in the market. But here's what I've learned over decades of helping businesses navigate risk. The businesses that survive and thrive through uncertain times are the ones that build operational maturity. And operational maturity starts with documentation discipline. The current trade environment, with nearly half of Canadian small business owners losing confidence in U.S. trade reliability, this isn't a temporary blip. This is a fundamental shift in how businesses need to think about supply chains, costs, and risk management. You can react to it scrambling each time something changes, or you can build resilience through systematic documentation of your processes, your costs, your options, and your plans. The businesses doing the latter, they're not just surviving the uncertainty, they're finding opportunities in it. They're winning customer contracts because they can offer supply reliability. They're getting better financing terms because lenders see operational maturity. They're sleeping better at night because they're not constantly firefighting. And it all starts with committing to the discipline of process documentation. Not as a compliance exercise, not as busy work, but as a strategic tool for building a more resilient, more competitive business. Here's what I want you to do. Hit that subscribe button right now because we're going to keep unpacking these critical risk areas that small business owners need to navigate. Every week, we're diving deep into the real challenges you're facing with practical strategies you can actually implement. And drop a comment. Tell me where you are in your documentation journey. Tell me what's blocking you. Let's build a community of business owners who are serious about managing risk and building resilient operations. I'll see you in the next one.